I just got really tired of it, you know. I needed time for myself. I felt like I was tapped out creatively, and I had to step away to recharge. The interviewer leans in. So, you're saying poverty, music, all that pressure, it drained you? Rick James nods slowly, eyes half closed, voice low but steady. Back then, he wanted to be bigger than Dylan. That's what he wanted. And he believed it was going to happen. Years later, just before his final breath, Rick James would leave behind something far darker than an interview soundbite. A last chilling testimony that felt less like gossip and more like a classified file being dragged out of a locked cabinet. Prince is not who you think he is. I know something nobody else dares to say. Those words, captured on video, cut straight through the polished myth Prince had spent an entire lifetime constructing. In their wake, whispers began to crawl out of the shadows, stories about sex, manipulation, addiction, and even a suspicious death. None of it sounded like the sanitized legend the world thought it knew. This was no longer just a rivalry between two music icons. It was said to be a truth buried for nearly 40 years. The real question became simple and terrifying. What exactly did Rick see? To understand the weight of those final words, you have to rewind everything, go back to the very first night these two men collided. Not in a friendly collaboration, not in some glossy duet, but in a wordless standoff that would quietly burn beneath the surface for decades. January 30th, 1980. The Fort Worth Convention Center in Texas throbbed with noise. Rick James's Fire It Up tour was officially launching. The whole arena pulsed with wild funk grooves, red stage lights blazing like sirens, and Rick's unmistakable, untamed movements slicing through the smoke-filled air. When Rick stepped into the spotlight, the crowd exploded. Hands shot up, people screamed his name, the floor almost vibrating with the weight of his fame. But what most people in those seats didn't know was that just minutes before, a young, quiet, almost ghost-like figure had already walked onto that same stage, played his set, and slipped away without a word. That figure was Prince Rogers Nelson. Born in Minneapolis, raised inside a broken black household, Prince was a strange combination of tragedy and genius. His mother sang in lounges to scattered applause. His father, a jazz musician, taught him piano, then vanished without even a proper goodbye. The absence hardened something in Prince. He grew up small, withdrawn, and ice-cold focused on one thing: music. By 19, he was already a one-man band, playing every instrument on his debut album. By 21, he'd locked in a deal with Warner Brothers, and released his second album, the self-titled Prince, on October 19th, 1979. Warner decided not to just sign him, but to test him in the harshest way possible. They threw him into the fire. The label made Prince the opening act for Rick James, the reigning king of funk, on more than 40 shows, starting in early 1980. For most new artists, that kind of exposure was a dream. For Rick, it was just business. To him, Prince was just a skinny kid in women's underwear, whispering lyrics like a ghost drifting through the mic. He didn't see a rival, he saw a sideshow, someone to warm up the crowd before the real storm arrived. What Rick didn't realize was that the most dangerous enemy is rarely the one who storms the gates. It's the one who stays quiet, watches, learns. After just 3 nights, something subtle and deadly shifted. The crowd wasn't just listening to Prince anymore. They were reacting to him, screaming his name, standing up the moment he hit his first chord. Some didn't even sit back down when his set ended. At first, Rick chalked it up to novelty, a phase. But by the 4th night, at the Milwaukee Arena on February 5th, something inside him finally cracked. Standing backstage, Rick watched Prince from the shadows. The lights washed over that slender frame as Prince stepped up to the microphone, leaned in, and shouted, "Say yeah!" The arena roared back in unison. Rick froze. His jaw tightened. "Say yeah" wasn't just some throwaway tag. It was his catchphrase, the line he had hammered into audiences for years, a ritual chant in every Rick James show. And now, right in front of his own fans, on his own tour, that signature call had been lifted and thrown back at him from another man's mouth. Stolen. On his stage. With his crowd. The rage didn't just rise, it detonated. Backstage, Rick kicked open his dressing room door and shouted Prince's name down the hallway. According to a lighting technician who claimed to be there, the next sounds were chaos-raised voices, furniture crashing, and what he described as a sickening thud, like a body slamming into a mirror. No official report ever confirmed what really happened in that room. But rumors flashed through the tour like sparks on dry wood. It was said that Rick grabbed Prince by the neck, slammed him against the wall, and growled through clenched teeth, "You ever copy one more of my moves, I'll kill you." Rick could live with imitation. He'd watched countless artists borrow his style. But what happened in mid-February in Cincinnati wasn't about music. It was personal. That night, Rick brought his mother backstage. An older woman with silver hair and tired eyes lit up with pride as she held a small photo in her hand. She walked up to Prince, carefully extended the picture, and asked softly, "Could you autograph this for me?" Prince looked at her, his face unreadable. He glanced at the photo, then said flatly, "I don't sign." No apology, no explanation, no attempt to soften it. He turned around and walked away. The room went quiet. Rick stood there beside his mother, fists clenched so tight the knuckles whitened, his face suddenly blank as if someone had hit a switch. He didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. He simply shut down. He didn't say another word for the rest of the night. Years later, in his 2007 memoir, Rick would recall that moment with one line that felt like a knife left in ice. "I really wanted to beat him to death." From that night forward, something hardened. Rick cut ties wherever he could. He told organizers to move Prince to a separate dressing room, far from his own. He refused to do joint stage appearances. When Prince knocked on his door at 3 a.m. to discuss the order of their sets, Rick didn't even get up. He just told his assistant, "When he's done performing, tell him to get the hell away from me." But Prince didn't fade. He didn't retreat. If anything, he sharpened. Night after night, city after city, he grew more focused, more magnetic, more dangerous. He wasn't just copying anymore. He was transforming, breaking the old rules, and writing new ones on the spot. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Rick James, the brightest, loudest flame in funk, felt himself being pulled into a kind of soft, creeping darkness. A shadow that didn't scream, didn't threaten, didn't announce itself. It just swallowed. Years later, when Purple Rain exploded and Prince stood at the absolute peak of stardom, Rick watched him on a TV screen. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then his lip curled, and he spat out a sentence like a verdict. He didn't get famous because he's good. He got famous because he knew how to steal. Their war was never declared, never made official in headlines or contracts. But it had already begun on that first blistering night in Texas when the king of funk stood frozen in the wings as a skinny kid in purple lingerie walked off with a spotlight that used to belong only to him. And from there, the tragedy was only just beginning. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. But the stolen stage moves were only the surface. For Rick James, that was just the first crack in something much bigger, much darker. What really ate at him, what turned irritation into a decade-long fixation, was the belief that Prince had started stealing ideas, entire concepts, visuals, a way of moving through the world that Rick thought he had carved out with his own blood and sweat. It was no longer just about a say yeah or a hip swivel. In Rick's mind, Prince had begun duplicating a whole aesthetic, an artistic universe, and a loyal fan base Rick had been building since the 1,970 Seconds from Nothing. In March 1983, at a press event at Motown Studios, Rick stood in front of cameras and finally announced a project he'd been quietly shaping since 1981, the Mary Jane Girls, a black all-female group, bold, sexy, able to sing and dance hard through funk, R&B, and disco without losing an inch of attitude. He handpicked them. He said he trained them himself. Every costume, every hairstyle, every onstage expression, he curated it like a painter obsessing over a canvas. Rick described the Mary Jane Girls as the feminine version of myself, a mirrored reflection of his own persona split into 4 bodies. They were supposed to debut by the end of that year. That was the plan. But they never got the clean launch he imagined. Before the Mary Jane Girls could properly arrive, another trio burst onto the scene. First, a girl group tied not to Rick James, but to Prince. Just months earlier, Vanity 6 had stepped into the spotlight, performing for the first time on August 14, 1982, at a trial show in Minneapolis. 3 women in lingerie, drenched in raw, unapologetic sex appeal, singing "Nasty Girl," a stripped-down synth-funk track written and produced by Prince. Vanity, the group's centerpiece, was often described as the female version of Prince. Same sharp features, same hypnotic stare, same cool detachment. People said she carried his energy, his style, even his emotional distance. But the detail that cut Rick the deepest was this. Vanity was reportedly the very woman he had wanted for the Mary Jane Girls. She had been on his radar, almost within reach, until she vanished after a private meeting with Prince in Los Angeles in April 1982. According to accounts from people around at the time, one day she was taking meetings about Rick's project, and the next she was gone, pulled into a closed-door conversation with Prince, and then simply removed from Rick's orbit. Just weeks later, Vanity officially announced she was joining Prince. The Mary Jane Girls still hadn't debuted. Their songs existed mostly as plans and demos. Meanwhile, Vanity 6 already had a hit single, an opening slot on Prince's 1999 tour, and growing rotation on MTV. Everywhere Rick turned, he saw Prince's fingerprints where he believed his own should have been. Rick snapped. On October 3, 1983, during an interview on Soul Train, he couldn't hold back. He said, "I trained them. I created that image. He just whispers a few words in those girls' ears and they disappear from my life. He doesn't just steal, he manipulates." That word manipulates hung in the air like a charge sheet. But in Rick's mind, the damage didn't stop with Vanity 6. According to Layla Steinberg, a former stylist who had worked with both camps, Prince began quietly pulling people out of Rick's circle one by one. Hairstylists, set designers, sound engineers, people Rick had counted on for years. It was said that they didn't argue, didn't complain, didn't even give detailed explanations. They just accepted new offers, took the deposits, and vanished into Prince's orbit without looking back. By the end of 1983, a new rumor started circling among industry insiders, low and careful, the way people talk when they're not sure who's listening. The story went like this. Prince had allegedly sent someone to spy on Rick's rehearsals at Sound City Studios in Los Angeles. Backstage whispers describe the same figure. A small black man, always in sunglasses and a fedora, drifting through the halls like just another crew member. He reportedly claimed to be a gear delivery guy, carrying a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. Inside that bag, people said, was a hidden tape recorder. Sound City was constantly crowded technicians, assistants, musicians, road crew. No one questioned another face walking through with cables or cases. One more anonymous body in a busy studio. Rick started to feel watched. He sensed something off, but he didn't have proof, just a tension in the air and faces he couldn't quite place. That changed the day he heard a particular live arrangement. Sometime later, Rick listened to Vanity 6 perform Sex Shooter. At first, it was just another track. But then, the bass line hit. The tempo settled in. The harmonies wrapped around the melody in a way that felt painfully familiar. It sounded almost identical to an unreleased Mary Jane Girls demo called Show Me Your Love, a track that, as far as Rick knew, had never been played outside their sessions at Sound City. It was still locked away, unheard by the public. Rick exploded. In a drunken fury, he screamed, "I never released that. No one outside that studio has heard it, so how the hell did he get it?" According to Levi Ruffin Jr., Rick's closest keyboard player and longtime ally, that moment pushed Rick from anger into something closer to paranoia. To him, this wasn't coincidence. It wasn't influence. It was strategy. A deliberate, calculated theft, executed from the shadows. But even with all that rage, there was one more twist of the knife. The most bitter part, the detail that kept him up at night, was brutally simple. He couldn't prove it. He couldn't take it to court. He couldn't sue. All he had were rumors, suspicions, and songs that sounded too close for comfort, and a rival who stayed just far enough in the dark to never be pinned down. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. But what disturbed people most, at least according to those who were there, didn't happen under the stage lights. It was what happened in the shadows off stage, in dressing rooms, at secluded estates, and inside circles that felt more like closed systems than creative communities. Some insiders claimed the real pattern was not just musical control, but the way Prince allegedly built relationships with very young people, usually standing right at the edge of adulthood. Rick once suggested that Prince wasn't looking for equals. He believed Prince was searching for people he could shape. In 1980, Susan Moonsey joined what would eventually become Vanity 6 while she was still a teenager. On stage, Susan projected a hyper-mature persona, lingerie, choreography, and a hard-edged confidence that fit the group's image. Off-stage, though, observers noticed something different. She almost never appeared alone in interviews or TV spots. Every outfit, every line, every public gesture seemed tightly coordinated. According to those who worked around them, Susan's statements were managed, her style choices approved, her media presence monitored. It was said that nothing happened in public without being filtered through Prince's vision first. The pattern, some people claimed, repeated itself a decade later. In 1990, Prince met Mayte Garcia, a young dancer who was reportedly only 16 at the time. After their first encounter, she didn't just get a job, she was invited to live and work at Paisley Park, his secluded creative compound. In her memoir, Mayte would later describe that period as existing inside a sealed-off world. There, daily routines, diet, clothing, and performance were not merely guided, but directed. She wrote that she was instructed on everything from her posture to her stage expressions, as if every detail of her being was part of a script she hadn't fully written herself. None of these women publicly tore Prince down. None of them mounted some explosive, career-ending accusation. On the record, they rarely spoke harshly about him at all. But they did share one haunting similarity. Most started young, became deeply dependent on the ecosystem he controlled, and then left quietly, as if carrying invisible luggage they never fully unpacked. Perhaps what made people the most uneasy beneath Prince's glamorous, boundary-breaking image was not just his sexuality or his style. It was what many described as an extreme need for control, a compulsion to design not just the music, but the lives orbiting around it. By 1982, when Prince officially formed Vanity 6, early signs of that tightly controlled ecosystem had already begun to surface. Brenda Bennett, one of the original members, later recalled that Prince had them sign contracts that essentially locked their careers to his approval. These agreements, according to her, prohibited solo releases without his explicit permission and restricted interviews unless every question was pre-approved in advance. On paper, it was called an artistic collaboration agreement. In practice, some would later compare it to a modern form of bondage, the kind of restrictive contract that has become infamous in conversations about the entertainment industry. One incident in particular stood out in the memories of those who were there. On June 14, 1983, Vanity, considered both Prince's muse and lover at the time, was scheduled for a Rolling Stone photo shoot and interview. Cameras were ready. The crew was in place. Yet, just 30 minutes before filming, the session was abruptly canceled. According to photographer George Dubose, the reason was simple. The questions hadn't been approved by Prince. When he walked into the room, Vanity said almost nothing. She kept her head lowered, her movements small, as if waiting for a signal. George recalled that she didn't truly relax or move freely until Prince gave the slightest nod, a silent cue that she could proceed. Inside his inner circle, control went beyond career decisions and press appearances. People close to the camp said Prince established a code even around his own name. Staff and collaborators were reportedly instructed never to call him Prince Rogers Nelson. Most were told to refer to him only as the artist, or simply him. One former assistant claimed that during a studio session, a sound engineer slipped and addressed him as Prince during a mic check. The story goes that the next day, that engineer's services were no longer required, No confrontation. No dramatic firing. He was just gone. In October 1986, while working on Sign O' the Times, Prince was said to have introduced an even stricter rule. No one was allowed to make direct eye contact with him unless he granted it. From then on, studio communication was described as strangely indirect staff speaking with lowered gazes or passing instructions through intermediaries instead of addressing him head-on. But it was the women around him, the singers, dancers, and muses who insiders believed felt the most pressure. A source close to Apollonia 6 later claimed that Prince secretly arranged for recording devices to be installed in the private phone lines of certain group members, especially those living near Paisley Park. These alleged recordings were said to be for protection, meant to guard his artistic image and prevent leaks. The same source claimed that he routinely checked messages, read personal letters, and monitored conversations between artists tied to his orbit. The only woman who openly hinted at feeling this surveillance was Jill Jones, a singer and longtime collaborator. In a 2001 interview with Dutch magazine Fader and echoed in later conversations, she said, "In essence, I always felt watched. Even in my own room, I was afraid he could hear me." Jill eventually walked away from her first solo project because Prince reportedly disapproved of the album's direction. She was also instructed, she said, to never discuss what happened at his house after she left Paisley Park. Around the same time, a little-known detail began to circulate among staff. The studio didn't just have locked doors. It had a hierarchy of access. Starting in 1987, Prince was said to have installed a magnetic keycard system throughout Paisley Park. Each employee received a card coded to a specific clearance level, restricting where they could and couldn't go. Some sections, people claimed, were marked off-limits to everyone but Prince and his two most trusted aides. Security officer Roderick, who worked there for a period, recalled one particular incident. A tour manager reportedly tried to enter what was known as the Purple Vault, a room where Prince stored his unreleased demos, recordings, and musical experiments. He was stopped in the hallway and turned away. A week later, that same tour manager was quietly reassigned. Not fired, not publicly shamed, just moved far away from Minneapolis, removed from the core of Prince's operations. Prince, it seemed, didn't just control the sound, he controlled the space, the information, and more, the people. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. Prince didn't just control rooms and doors, he controlled money. According to people who worked inside his circle, female artists tied to him, some who had been by his side for years, couldn't simply access their own earnings whenever they wanted. Payments were filtered through a financial representative assigned by Prince's company. If they needed advances, they had to explain why. If the justification wasn't convincing enough, the answer was usually no. In one internal dispute in 1995, it was said that Vanity requested an advance from European tour funds. The amount wasn't outrageous, about $25,000, but the request was denied, labeled as insufficient justification. That money, according to those close to the situation, stayed right where it was. In a company account back in Minneapolis, no clear explanation, no closure. Between 1,984 and 1,992. While Prince was releasing Purple Rain, Parade, Sign O' the Times, and other albums that critics would later call masterpieces, he didn't live like a regular recording artist. He lived more like something detached from the rest of the world, an entity, not a person. Many collaborators described him as if he came from another planet, a place where every gesture followed rules no one else fully understood. Prince didn't eat with the crew. He didn't sit around catering tables or hang out in common kitchens after rehearsal. At Paisley Park, he had a private elevator installed that rose straight to the top floor, his level. Up there, meals were prepared to strict specifications. No salt, no oil, no animal products. A private chef would cook, deliver the plate, and leave immediately. No small talk. No lingering. Almost no one had his personal phone number, not even longtime assistants. Communication was channeled through internal lines, office intercoms, or handwritten notes slid under doors or left on consoles. During the shoot for the Kiss video in 1986, a stylist reportedly wrote a note asking to change his outfit because the weather had shifted unexpectedly. The answer came back the same way, a note. Just 3 words. Not necessary. Prince. No discussion, no follow-up questions. After that, no one asked again. Internal meetings at Paisley Park had their own ritual too. They were held in a soundproof room, no chairs, no tables, no visible comfort. Prince himself rarely appeared in these sessions. Instead, a spokesperson would walk in, unfold a yellow notepad, and read his handwritten instructions out loud. When they finished, they left. No questions, no debate, no clarification. One lighting technician recalled the feeling. We didn't even know who actually wrote some of it, but if you interpreted it wrong, you wouldn't be told off. You'd just stop getting calls. One day you were there, the next day you weren't invited back. In the recording studio, Prince preferred to work alone, especially at night. He would lock himself inside, run the boards himself, and build tracks in silence. By morning, demo tapes would appear slid under the mixing room door, like messages from another realm. On one occasion, a producer tried to pair Prince with a new female artist for a collaboration. A demo was sent. An invitation was extended. The only response that came back was a handwritten note with 2 words that felt like a rule he lived by. Work alone. Tour manager Alan Leeds once described Prince's movements between 1983 and 1989 as almost covert. According to him, Prince would sometimes leave venues without telling anyone, switch cars in the middle of the route, and disappear into hotels only a handful of people knew about, if that. In Frankfurt, Germany, the crew reportedly waited backstage for nearly 3 hours, assuming he was resting before a meeting. Eventually, they learned Prince had left that morning. No goodbye. No explanation. Just gone. Then there was the surveillance. One of the most unsettling details to emerge about Paisley Park was the hidden camera system that former staff claimed was installed without open discussion. It was said that nearly every room had at least one blind spot, a small, dead zone, where you could stand briefly, but not for long. If someone lingered too long in those blind zones, they might later find a printed warning in their internal mailbox. No signature, no indication of who had watched them, just a reminder that someone always was. And at midnight, another rule clicked into place. Prince required everyone else to vacate workspaces before 12 a.m. unless they had direct permission to stay. After midnight, the building belonged to him alone. No one knew what he did in those isolated hours. No one dared to ask. In 1999, an internal leak almost blew the door off that quiet control. A member of the New Power Generation, NPG, accused Prince of hiding secret clauses in their contract's terms that allegedly blocked them from releasing solo work for up to 10 years. No solid legal proof ever surfaced publicly, and the case never became an official scandal. But the rumor itself was enough. Almost overnight, people started leaving. Partnerships ended, projects dissolved, the band changed. Yet, out of everything Rick James ever heard, watched, or suspected about Prince, the controlling contracts, the alleged spying, the strict rules, none of it haunted him the way one particular belief did. For Rick, the deepest, most disturbing question wasn't about music or money, it was about identity. He believed that behind the makeup, the lace, the heels, and the carefully built mystique, Prince himself didn't fully know whether he was a man, a woman, or something in between, and that he had spent his entire life trapped inside that uncertainty. The world knew that the 1,980 seconds marked Prince's explosive breakthrough, not just as a musician, but as an image, something larger than himself. When Dirty Mind dropped on October 8, 1980, Prince walked onto the American stage and tore gender norms apart with his bare hands. He performed in bikini briefs, sheer lace tops, high heels, curled hair, and smeared purple lipstick. To the public, it felt groundbreaking, a revolution in how a black male artist could look and move in mainstream music. To Rick James, it was something else entirely. In a Soul Train interview segment from around 1981 that reportedly never aired, Rick said something that stayed with those who heard it. He suggested that Prince didn't simply choose a gender. He chose power through gender. It wasn't masculinity or femininity. It was control over how people saw him, desired him, or feared him. Then there was André Simone. André wasn't just some bassist in the background. He was Prince's childhood friend, his classmate, one of his earliest bandmates in their teenage group Grand Central back in 1974. They lived together in Prince's father's house, rehearsed daily, shared food, clothes, and insomnia. But according to a lighting assistant from the Controversy Tour in 1981, there was an energy between them that felt heavier than friendship, though no one dared define it out loud. In June 1982, while Prince was recording 1999, André left the band. The official explanation was simple: creative differences. But insiders suspected something more personal had cracked between them. A staffer at Sunset Sound later recalled walking into a mixing room one evening earlier than expected. He claimed he saw Prince and André sitting very close together, backs turned to the door. When he entered, they jerked apart slightly, not caught doing anything explicit, but surrounded by a tension so thick he said it made the rest of the night hard to breathe. Over time, people noticed a pattern. When a male colleague got too close, Prince would eventually pull away. During the Purple Rain tour in 1984, a dancer named Marcus was brought into the fold. He trained at Paisley Park, but unlike others, he wasn't housed with the rest of the crew. His presence was quiet, almost hidden. On July 17, 1984, after a show in Chicago, someone reportedly spotted Prince and Marcus sitting very close together backstage, their body language more intimate than coworkers usually share. A security guard later said it looked like something deeper, something unspoken. The next day, Marcus was gone. No official explanation, no farewell. Rehearsal records and photos that included him were quietly scrubbed from tour archives. By 1985, he had practically vanished from the industry's memory. The last trace anyone claimed to have heard was that he became a dance instructor somewhere in Belgium. Beyond that, nothing. No confirmation, no closure. Just another ghost attached to Prince's orbit. Rick James knew these stories. He collected them, repeated them, turned them over in his mind like crime scene photos. And he was convinced they were just the beginning. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. Over the years, the stories around Prince's inner circle began to blur together. Some people claimed that one of the men who disappeared from his orbit ended up in Europe teaching dance. Others insisted that rumor actually belonged to a different musician who came later, a man tied to Prince during one of his most experimental tours. No one could say for sure. What they did agree on was the pattern. People got close, then they were gone. Rick James knew about these whispers. He collected them like fragments of a puzzle he could never quite complete. In a rare recording from late 1984, Rick was heard saying, "I got no problem with gay folks, but I do have a problem with people pretending they're not." He never said Prince's name out loud in that clip, but people around him believed they understood who he meant. Rick hinted more than once that Prince had crossed that invisible line long ago, living a life he would never admit to publicly, wrapped in secrecy while presenting another version of himself to the world. "He's just better at hiding it," Rick reportedly told a friend. By 1987, during the Sign O' the Times tour, that suspicion only grew. It was rumored that a substitute drummer on the tour wasn't just a musician filling in. For about 4 months, insiders whispered that he was Prince's special companion. They were seen leaving venues separately from the rest of the crew, sometimes in a private car no one else was allowed to use. Questions weren't just discouraged, they were unthinkable. On October 21, 1987, in Milan, a French photographer working backstage claimed he captured something that explained why people felt the air change when those two were in the same room. He said he stepped into a dressing area and saw Prince sitting close beside the drummer, head gently resting on the man's shoulder. No posing, no performance, no crowd. Just a quiet moment in a dim room, the kind of closeness that doesn't need words. The photographer lifted his camera and took the shot. That image never made it to mainstream magazines. It never became a cover story or a headline. Instead, according to underground European zines at the time, the photo circulated quietly, passed from hand to hand under the caption, "The moment he let go." Soon after, everything changed. It was said that Prince abruptly cut ties with the drummer. No public fight, no official statement, no visible scandal. One day he was there, playing, traveling, moving inside Prince's tight inner orbit. The next, he was gone. The tour went on. The shows continued. But people who were there remembered the tension that lingered backstage, a kind of silence that felt heavier than the loudest argument. According to one road crew member, the drummer's name was suddenly rarely spoken. He slipped into the same strange category as others who had once been close to Prince, and then simply vanished. The last anyone claimed to have heard, he had resurfaced quietly in Belgium, working as a dance instructor, far from stadium lights and purple stages. Whether that detail was ever fully verified didn't seem to matter. For those who carried the story, it fit the pattern too well. No one could confirm the full truth behind these relationships, how deep they went, what lines were crossed, what promises were made or broken. But the sudden disappearances and the thick, unspoken tension that followed them were things people around Prince never forgot. To Rick James, these weren't just random stories or fan gossip. He treated them like evidence in a file he was building in his head. He believed that all of these incidents, the dancers who vanished, the bandmates who got too close, the rumored lovers who were erased from official history, were only the tip of an enormous iceberg. Because beneath the music, beneath the lace and the eyeliner and the carefully curated mystery, Rick was convinced there was a deeper truth about who Prince really was and how far he would go to keep that truth buried. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. Rick James believed these stories were only the beginning, small fractures in something much larger hiding underneath. He once said, according to people close to him, "Prince doesn't belong to any category. He's his own universe. He walks into a room, changes the air, makes everyone forget who they are, then leaves and lets everyone else clean up the mess." That was how Rick saw him, not just as a rival or a star, but as a force that warped reality. Even in 2004, just months before his own death, Rick was still fixated on one thing, the person behind the myth. He held on to a belief that Prince had spent his entire life inside a body that never truly felt stable, not because of how it looked, but because of everything he could never say aloud. A member of Rick's post-production team later claimed that on the night before Rick was hospitalized, he sat in front of a TV replaying an old Prince clip. The room was quiet, just the flicker of purple-tinted light on Rick's face. After a long silence, Rick whispered, "He's so damn lonely, and he doesn't know why." To Rick, that was the real tragedy. He believed that because Prince had to bury his truest self for decades, from questions about gender and desire to those ambiguous relationships that evaporated without explanation, he ended up trapped inside his own creation. A prisoner locked inside the very purple kingdom the world celebrated. As Prince's fame grew, so did the perimeter around his private life. He built walls that looked like style, mystery, genius, but underneath, there was a simple, non-negotiable rule. Nobody touches what's personal. He forbade anyone from getting too close to the real story. No one knew who he actually lived with day to day. No one really knew who he loved beyond the public narratives the press picked up. Very few people ever saw the physical toll his body carried from years of performing in impossible outfits, on impossible stages, at impossible heights. In public, Prince floated perfect posture, flawless suits, controlled smiles. In private, according to those who caught glimpses, the mask slipped in small, unsettling ways. A wince stepping off stage, a hand pressed briefly against his hip, the tiny hesitations of a man whose body had absorbed more pain than he was willing to admit. That secrecy was not just about romance or identity. It extended to every wound, every weakness. Prince cultivated an image that allowed no room for cracks. To the outside world, he was untouchable. No messy breakdowns, no public intoxication, no uncontrolled outbursts. If there was chaos, it happened behind closed doors. That's why, for many, his death still feels less like an accident and more like the last page of a story nobody was allowed to read from the beginning. Both Rick James and Prince died with drugs in their systems, but the worlds they came from could not have been more different. Rick's downfall was loud, public, and humiliating. Prince's collapse was almost silent, hidden in the same shadows where he had spent years hiding everything else. And it all led to one of Hollywood's most haunting questions. When a man spends his entire life controlling the narrative, what really happens in the moments no one gets to see? If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. That's why, for many people watching from the outside, Prince's death still feels like one of Hollywood's darkest unanswered questions. Both Rick James and Prince died with drugs in their system, but the way they fell revealed two completely different worlds. Rick went out messy, loud, and unforgivingly public. Prince slipped away quietly in purple light, leaving millions stunned when they learned he had been using powerful painkillers under a fake name for years, and almost no one around him knew. Rick was an open addict. He was arrested, convicted, dragged in front of judges with hollow, bloodshot eyes. He stood there and admitted, "I'm a junkie. I don't hide it." His chaos was visible, ugly, undeniable, but honest. Prince was the opposite. He never allowed anyone to see him unravel. No public drunkenness, no visible drug abuse, no scandalous meltdowns caught on camera. He built an image of total control, disciplined, clean, almost untouchable. But on April 21, 2016, that image shattered. Prince was found unresponsive in the elevator at Paisley Park, the very place he had turned into his private universe. The coroner's report would later confirm what the world struggled to accept. Prince died from an overdose of fentanyl, a synthetic opioid so potent it can be fatal in microgram doses around 50 times stronger than heroin. And that wasn't the only disturbing detail. Investigators discovered opioid pills hidden inside vitamin bottles and supplement jars. Labels carried the name Peter Bravestrong, an alias Prince reportedly used for private medication purchases. There were no official prescriptions, no standard medical trail, no single doctor publicly attached to his treatment. Shipments came in from various pharmacies across multiple states. All of it pointed toward one chilling reality. Prince had been concealing his drug use for years, not just from the public, but from many of the people closest to him. So the question became unavoidable. Why would someone praised for living clean, disciplined, and drug-free end up dependent on pills? The pieces of that answer surfaced only after his death. According to several people who had known him in his later years, Prince was living with chronic, relentless hip pain. Decades of high heels, splits, spins, jumps, and stage dives had wrecked his joints. Behind the smooth moves and flawless shows, his body was paying the price. Doctors, it was said, recommended joint surgery. But as a devout Jehovah's Witness, Prince reportedly refused. Surgery involving blood transfusions was against his beliefs. Faced with the choice between violating his faith or living with excruciating pain, he took a third path, the quiet one: painkillers. But even then, he refused to let the world see him as weak, injured, or dependent. No official personal physician announcing treatment plans, no public medical statement, no interviews about health struggles. He kept the myth alive, the myth of the untouchable genius, endlessly in control. In reality, he was terrified. Terrified of breaking the illusion. Terrified that if people saw the pain, they would stop seeing the legend. But a body can't keep secrets forever. By 2014, those paying attention noticed Prince changing. At Paisley Park shows, he would sometimes leave the stage early. Between sets, he sat alone in darkened rooms for hours, ignoring ringing phones and unanswered knocks. Assistants reportedly found him some nights asleep in full stage clothes, guitar still in his hands, as if he'd simply collapsed between worlds. More and more he pulled inward. Paisley Park, once a hive of music and movement, hardened into a fortress. No one went to the top floor unless ordered. Staff members recalled that after 10 p.m., Prince would sometimes hold closed-door meetings that ran until dawn. No agendas, no minutes, no explanations. People went in, people came out. No one talked. At the same time, his relationships grew shorter and more opaque. Muses appeared and disappeared like projections on a screen. Some left because of strict contracts, some because they felt too isolated. Others slipped out of the industry completely, like they'd been erased. A former colleague described the emotional pressure this way. He never yelled. He didn't have to. He made you feel guilty for stepping outside his orbit. The need to protect a flawless image, combined with mounting loneliness and physical agony, pushed Prince further into himself. Then, just 1 week before his death, everything nearly ended on a plane. After a show, Prince reportedly became unresponsive mid-flight. The crew thought he was exhausted, maybe dehydrated. In reality, he'd overdosed. The pilot was forced to make an emergency landing. Prince was revived with medication, stabilized, and given a brief window to step back from the edge. He didn't take it. According to reports, he refused a full hospital stay, returned home the next morning, and instructed that his medical records from that incident be destroyed. 7 days later, he was gone. No goodbye, no final statement, no one at his side in those last seconds. He died alone, inside the compound he had built as his personal paradise and his ultimate prison. Rick James once summed up the difference between them in a single, brutal line. I died in front of the world, but he died right in the middle of his own spotlight. And nobody knew how desperate he really was. Prince's death remains a cold reminder of a harsh truth. Sometimes what destroys us isn't just the substance. It's how perfectly we learn to hide the pain that led us there. Years earlier, before his own body gave out, Rick James had already drawn his conclusion. He left behind a final, unnerving message that many believed was aimed straight at Prince and everything he represented. Before taking his last breath, Rick James recorded a chilling final testament that seemed to freeze the entire music world. Prince is not who you think he is. I know something nobody else dares to say. That single clip, replayed and analyzed, tore straight through the carefully constructed image Prince had defended for decades. In its wake, stories began to spill out whispers of sex, manipulation, addiction, and a death that some people still view as suspicious. This was never just a story about two music legends. It was presented as a truth buried for 40 years, layered under fame, silence, and fear. And the question that lingers is the same one that began this journey. What exactly did Rick see? To understand the full weight of those final words, you have to go back. Back to the opening night, the backstage corridors, the first clash of egos and shadows, back to where it all began. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their